Craig Ed, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Egan. It's good to be here.
So, take me back to the cancer battle, 16, 17. How did that change your life at that point?
So, up until that point, life was pretty normal. Normal teenager, doing normal things. There was maybe a year and a half of symptoms that were leading up to it, which we didn't really pick up on the time. So, I was an elite swimmer, used to swim in all the Scottish development squads, was a Scottish champion as well. And I started to notice that my energy levels were starting to drop quite significantly. And, you just think, well, there's an imbalance somewhere. I'm obviously, I'm going through puberty. There's lots of stuff happening with the body. I'm growing, so it could all be related to that. But I started to get psoriasis as well on my arms and shoulders. Again, something that you would think, oh, that's not really related to anything at all. And I developed this cough as well. So had this cough for months and months and months. And I'd been to the doctor a few times, and the doctor said, you've got glandular fever, we think. Just take it easy, just rest, your glands are up. No blood test was done, but that was their diagnosis. And that happened for about a year and a half, until one day I woke up and I thought I'd broken my ribs. And this didn't seem out of the ordinary because I'd been playing football the night before. And I just thought, oh, maybe I've got an elbow in the ribs, and I was just not really noticed it at the time. So I go to school that day, and it's getting worse and worse. And I used to work as a lifeguard, and I was supposed to be working at night. So I did what any 16-year-old boy does. I call my mum, and I just said, "Can you make me a doctor's appointment? Something's not quite right with my ribs." So I go to the doctor, and I see the family doctor this time. The previous times had been other doctors in the surgery. And my doctor looks at my notes and he says, you got to get down to the hospital like straight away. And I kind of looked at my mum, and the colour on her face just sort of drained a little bit. And we get in the car and we're driving down to the hospital. And in that moment, the car is like super quiet. So like I'm not talking, mum's not talking. We're kind of in this space where we don't quite know if this is serious or if this is not serious, or you've got a 15-minute journey in just pure silence. We get to the hospital, and they send me for a scan, and that scan confirms that I've got Hodgkin's lymphoma, but also non-Hodgkin's kind of elliptical cells. And for those at home, it's a cancer of your lymphatic system, so your immune system essentially. And it was pretty bad. It was borderline stage 4. So it was a tumour the size of a tennis ball under my left arm. It was a tumour the size of a 50-cent piece in my spleen, which was causing the pain in my ribs. I was pressing against that. A tumour the each side of my neck, about the size of a pea, and then a 10-centimetre tumour underneath my lungs. So that's what was causing that cough, that compression. And that kicked off a year of chemotherapy, and I then went into remission. But during that chemotherapy, obviously, as a 16-year-old, this happened at the start of the summer. So a lot of people had seen me at school at the end of the school year, went to summer holidays. Then I come back and I'm like this ghost, basically. I'm like this bald, skinny ghost that is kind of like roaming the halls, And, one thing I would say is, like, for anybody in any stage or in any stage of their life, is to have a good social group around you to support you, because when stuff like this happens, you rely on that support network to help bring you through and to, in that situation, to create normality for the person. So for me, I was still learning to drive. I was still going to school. Like, I'd get chemotherapy on a Wednesday and I'd be in school Thursday. And then you're taking tons of drugs, getting chemotherapy every week for a year. And then you get into remission and, I was like, yeah, this is amazing. I can finally get back on track with my life. I was just about to go into the last year of school. Big plans for the future, to go to university. When I got another test done, and they were like, it's actually a lot deeper in your chest than we actually thought, which there's probably been no lower moment for me was that day, because having battled through all of that year, only to be told that you would have to go through another year of even more intensive chemotherapy, stem cell transplant, and radiotherapy in order to finally beat it. That was a I'll never forget that day. That was the longest day probably of my life, and for my family too, because the family are affected just as much as you. And there were times when I felt more sorry for my parents than I did for myself, because they because they love you very dear and they want the best for you, and then you have to work with them to battle through all that all as a family. But luckily, after the stem cell transplant and after having all the chemotherapy, I went back into remission again when I was 18, and luckily I've never been back to that point, and that was 20 years ago now.
Mm. What were you thinking and feeling at the time? Were you thinking about death?
It's interesting because you go through those phases where you go through the why me phase, which is why is it me that has to have this? What reason is it that I'm going through this right now? And as a teenager, people don't want to stick out, when they're in high school, but ultimately you do. And it's really, I've always been the kind of character who embraced difference. So I've always went against the curve, as we'll hear from everything that I've done basically since then. I always go against conventional, pathways for a lot of things, and maybe that moment was part of that. But yeah, you go through the why kind of me phase, and then you start thinking about, especially after the first diagnosis and after getting told for the second time, you go into a dark period, and it really tests you, because that's the first time where potentially you can't see a future. So beforehand, you can see a future, and then the next day, all of a sudden, you can't see a future. And for a young kid, that's a really difficult thing to kind of comprehend and think about. Um, but ultimately, it's up to you as an individual to understand that, like, for me, I'd already beaten this one time, and this second time, while it was going to be more difficult, it became reframed into an inconvenience and a delay in the process. And I've come to realize, as I've got older, that these situations, you need to look at them as a gift. What is the gift from this terrible situation? And, that gift is being realized now, where I'm in a position to take that resilience, take those learnings from that young age, and then apply them to the things that I do later in life.
How can people reframe their hard experiences they're currently in to endure them more effectively? Because it's quite easy to slip into the why me victim mindset, but what tools or strategies can we use to reframe the pain that we're currently feeling to endure it, but also get the most out of it?
I think you need something that is to break free from that moment where you're in your head and you're insular. And for me, that was music. So music for me at that time was one of the most important things in my life. And using music is a way to change your mood instantly. I still use this today to bring out an emotion or bring out a way of feeling or a memory stamp from playing a certain song. And that to me can give you a state change very quickly. Um, and I'd urge everybody to think of music as a way to achieve a mindset change quickly and start exploring what that might look like. So for me, when things were really bad, I would then fall into music, which had absolutely nothing to do with my current situation, but it was something I could tap into. The second thing that I would recommend is to thoroughly think about your social circle. So this is in a case of like allowing you to, again, not escape from your current situation, but to be reminded of the good things that are happening to you. And a person who's not in the same mindset as you can help you um, be reminded of that positive change. So, for instance, an example would be me and my friend Lee used to support our Dunfermline Athletic, our local football team. And through all this kind of madness of chemotherapy and everything, having that thing to look forward to on a Saturday, which allowed us to go and just be completely present on the field, like watching the game. All of a sudden, after the game, because you've allowed your brain to shift out of that moment into more a dopamine filled or a completely different thing, it's very hard sometimes to then get back into that negative framework because you've filled it with other things that bring you joy. So, yeah, these are just two examples. Finding joy in the things that you love, hobbies and things. And for me personally, music and sport or other things as well, we're able to do that.
Something I've been using to, I guess, endure the more difficult times is when I have a clear vision of where I want to go, I can reframe the hard experiences as necessary conditions in order to have future success. So, for example, podcasting, right? If my numbers, growth is taking a long time, I sometimes futurecast this as the story I'll tell at episode 300, 400, 500 for why I got there in the end. So a lot of the time, whether it's starting up a business, starting a health journey, the hard times, you need to reframe them as necessary for the future success that you're going to have.
Absolutely. And here's another example for you. I would say that, when in your current situation that you're in now, you can only relate to the hardest things that have currently happened to you. You can't think about the future things that will be harder than the current situation right now. So all you have is your own experiences. But for most people, when they were in primary school, maybe standing up in front of someone and talking might be the hardest thing they've ever done. And to them, that's the hardest thing they've ever done. That's their only frame of reference. Maybe they'll go into high school and they might be their exams. Their exams are the hardest thing they've ever done. And to them, that's their frame of reference. And then as you move through life, you realize when you sit another exam, say in university, you might think about the exam you did in high school and go, that was a piece of cake. Now this is the hardest thing. But you'll probably realize that you proved to yourself that you could do that thing. And then that should give you the confidence then to then do what you need to do, knowing that you'll learn and then move on to the next challenge. That's another tool I like to use.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people's perception of their circumstances is quite negative because they're expecting to achieve something in order to prove something. So they've set out these goals, these ambitions, and they're doing it because they want to prove that they're capable or good enough. And it can often be sourced back to the fear of one person's opinion of them. And a lot of the reason we take action is from fear to the conditioning, the experiences that we've gone through to please our parents, to please society. So I think if people can give themselves the opportunity to figure out where their drive and ambition is coming from, and strip away some of the fear, and they can get to more an authentic roots, then I feel like it also takes away this pressure, because the pressure literally has been created by this narrative and this story that they've almost fallen into without taking ownership. And because 95% of the actions we take each day are done unconsciously, if we don't start to have conversations about why we're doing things and start to bring things from the unconscious mind into the conscious mind, we're literally going to be chasing after things that are not actually truly meant for us, but from things that we have learnt we should be doing from the hard experiences. So I think learning to have hard conversations with yourself is an important tool.
I would say one of the key things I did when I went through a lived experience training course, and I worked with a great coach, and one of the first things he got me to do was a life map in order to develop the story and the narrative, and really put together the story I had. And when doing this life map, it was really, you're focusing on the highs and the lows far back as you can remember. And what's really interesting is that when you think of in your timeline, there are key moments in your life where certain things happened and you haven't, because you're a lot younger, you haven't really understood the meaning of why you've held on to this memory. So I'll give you an example. You know, when I was really young, we were like, maybe I was like 5 years old. We were going to this wedding, and like my mum put me in this waistcoat that had all these bugs on it, and she was super proud of this. This is the early 90s, remember? And I remember at the time thinking, I don't feel comfortable in this waistcoat. I'm only 5 years old, but I was thinking there's something not quite right. And I've remembered this, I've had this memory for years and years and years. And when doing this life map, I remembered this situation, and I was like, what was it about that was so important? And I remember it being the first time that I ever felt self-conscious. It was the first time I'd ever really thought of what I looked like, or what other people's perception of me looked like. And then I started to think about what that meant for me moving forward as an adult, and what values and lessons that I'd perhaps drawn from all these little individual things from my life map. And then when it came to piecing together the lived experience speaking talks that I used to do, then you're able to draw on all these things and then understand the emotion involved in the learnings, and it makes you realize that life is that journey, and being able to reflect on these ones is where you're going to get the most out of your personal development journey.
We often have an imbalanced perception of the experiences that we've gone through. So we go through the breakup and we're only focusing on the pain of the heartbreak. But that's because our primal brain, the amygdala, forces us to go into a fight or flight response, and it fixates on running away from the pain or going towards the pleasure. So it has this biased perception of reality, because for every good thing that happened in a moment, there's bad parts too, and vice versa. And part of balancing our perception and bringing us back to reality is going back to that experience and being able to list out positives and negatives to the experience. So we look back at the heartbreak and people start to form beliefs of, I'm not good enough, I'll never be worthy. But the benefit is, it's forced them to figure out who they are at their core without any attachments. It's forced them to be more independent. It's forced them to better themselves. And through every experience, there is polarity. There is positives and negatives. And I think part of relinquishing fear from our life can be going through on a timeline a lot of our hardest experiences and being able to see both sides of that experience. And this is what I was learning through my last episode with Mitchell Vickridge. was that most of our fear is driven through our amygdala, our primal brain, and anything that happens in the external environment is neutral, right? But our mind creates meaning to it because we have over 170 cognitive biases, and and our brain is interpreting things. It can interpret things through the fear brain, the amygdala, run away from pain or towards pleasure. And part of becoming more conscious is being able to see experiences simultaneously, be able to see both aspects of things. Because I know for me on my journey, I get really, really excited about, they call it the fantasy of, I'm going to do this thing, all the positives, we get seduced into running towards pleasure, but there are all these unconscious negatives that our brain is shutting off, and vice versa. Let's say we get broken up with, we're fixating so hard on the negatives. But I think the power of becoming conscious and balancing our perception is we can see both parts of our current moment simultaneously and become more neutral. And because we can't see reality with a more balanced perception, there's such a strong emotional charge to the situation, and that's what he believes depression is this fantasy away from reality. Our mind is comparing life, the reality, to what it wants it to be, what it thinks it could have had. And I found this episode quite fascinating because I relate it back to my hard experiences, and a lot of it now is going back and being able to see both sides of what happened rather than just fixating on one.
I think one of the best things people can learn is how to gain perspective quickly. And I think that's what you're alluding to there. It's like having the ability in the moment to see those positives and negatives. And that's a skill set that you can actually develop. That's something that you can teach yourself to be balanced in your views in the moment and not have an emotional response. Because like you said, when you are in an emotional state, your thinking is driven by all these biases that you have. But if you can strip the emotion out of a decision, you can make much better and quicker decisions that are going to help benefit you later in life. I would say for me personally, the flotation tank is the way that the quickest way for me to get out of the environment and get out of my head and think not just logically but creatively about a situation, and then think about that while I'm in there, to the point where I can see the positive outcome and I can see the next step. And a lot of people can do this through breath work. You can do that in the ice bath by just cutting through whatever's in your head, breaking through that barrier, filling it with dopamine, and then allowing you to make a less emotional decision after the ice bath.
I feel like a lot of it is neutralizing the emotional charge to an event, positive or negative. So sometimes we take risks, but it's because we're seduced by the fantasy of it all working out, and then we act irrationally. But part of making good decisions that I'm learning is being able to neutralize a positive or negative charge, to be able to lean into our forebrain, our thinking brain, rather than through our amygdala, which is either taking us away from pain or towards pleasure. And removing stimulus like the physical stimulus, the trigger, going to the float tank, I feel is like a perfect thing. Or breath work. It's a similar concept. It's taking you away from the charge of the event and able to lean into the creativity and the power of our mind, because I think a lot of us live in our fear brain, our amygdala, but we don't realize our innate capabilities.
Yeah. I would say that one of the most important things people can do is when they get, I'll give you an example. So at our studio, we try and bring together, we bring, float tanks, ice baths, saunas, things that have quite powerful and complex reactions within the body. But we try and make it accessible to the everyday person. And a lot of what we talk about is everyday examples that these services can help with. And one thing that is very, very common for a lot of people is that they'll just be going about their day, absolutely normal, and all of a sudden they get this shitty text message from someone, and they are then left to react to that. They didn't ask for it. It wasn't something they'd expected, but all of a sudden they're filled with adrenaline. The adrenaline's filling the body. They can feel themselves getting angry. They can feel like themselves responding negatively. And it's very hard for someone in that moment to just go, you know what? I'm just going to wait. I'm going to wait until the emotional charge has subsided. And then in my rational mind, I'm going to respond to that text message. That is something, that is a skill that people can learn. And
well, the quick statistic is when we do go into that fight or flight response and cortisol starts getting released, we lose up to 50% of our prefrontal cortex ability.
Absolutely.
So we just, that part of the brain gets shut off and we're living in our amygdala. Exactly.
Yeah. My my missus will tell you a story. I mean, it happens to me quite often, and I'll get a text message like that, and if I'm not quite in like my I'd say if I'm not 100% that day, just say I'm running like 60% sort of like energy, mentally, physically, she'll ask me, "What's the text message about?" And I'll just go, uh, I'll just mumble. My brain is like not able to actually articulate my what is in front of me, and that is a lot of people probably experience that as well, and that's just an example of what's actually happening in your body. Like your prefrontal cortex is shutting down. You're not actually able to logically explain something that should be super easy for you to do, and that's where um, recognizing that and figuring out strategies to cope with that is so important.
When you look back to the cancer now, how has that played as like a foundational experience, being this top mountain that you've climbed, and are you able to consciously use that as an experience you look back on, or do you feel like this becomes embedded within the subconscious and it is not something you reflect on consciously, but it is something you know you've gone through, and these smaller tasks, smaller mountains seem more capable, or is it something you have to actually bring to front of mind to remember the strength and the capabilities you have?
I think a bit of both. I think a lot of that resilience was already within me, and or because it would have to be to push through something like that. But I mean, I often I often think about that journey, especially because of what we do now. It's part of our story. We talk about it, so I'm often reminded of that, my past through our studio. But nothing will ever be more difficult than that time. But it was a different time. I didn't have the same responsibilities that I do now. And the thing that sticks in my mind is like if something like that happened again, I'd probably have to dig a lot deeper, because a lot more is at stake now where I'm at in my life if something like that happens. So
Do you think then perceived stakes plays a role? So a lot of the challenge that we face, the impact it has on us comes from our perception of what it means for us in our life. So how does the stakes and the things at play impact our assessment of the perceived threat?
one thing I'm trying to do a lot more of is not waste energy and time on things that haven't happened. I can't remember who said it, but essentially the quote is, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's like worrying about something that hasn't happened is like worrying about it twice over. So you worry about it that it might happen, and then when it does happen, you're worrying about it again.
Epictetus, I think.
I can't quite remember.
It's one of those. It's either
Yeah.
Seneca or Epictetus.
And that stuck in my mind because there's things that you can control and things that you can't control. And the things that used to keep me up at night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, are things that were always out with my control. And so I started to realize that I should just be getting up each day and worrying about things that I can control.
How do you discern what's in your control and out of your control. It might seem easy, but I think a lot of us convince ourselves that we have more control over things than we do.
I think a simple way to look at it is, if I say something to someone, will that have an impact? If there's an action that I can take, will that have an impact? If there's no conversation, if there's no action, then it's not something you can control.
How would you measure impact?
Well, I would measure impact by, before making the decision, knowing what your preferred outcome would be. And a lot of work I've done for myself is not allowing my decision making to impact another person negatively in order to get something that I want. So one thing that I'm really conscious of is, if I have an action in mind, um, then it has to bring up everyone involved in that decision.
Mm. So what process do you have for that to ensure that it's not a zero-sum game where you're benefiting at the expense of other people? How do you expand your system to bring others up with you?
Look at your core values to start with. So, is what your decision doing part, does it tie into at least one of your core values? If it doesn't, then look at what it says about you, and think of it as a way of refining your own values. But also, when people come and work, like for Clear Mind Studio, I actually use my own core values to hire other people to come and work for us. So they must have these values in order to successfully work with us. Um, Now, the core values for myself are integrity, responsibility, um, and accountability. That's the three ones for Clear Mind Studio that I personally try to instill. And we can cover all the positive work that we can do within our studio through um, those three value systems. So when I'm making a decision for the studio, say I'm I'm asking someone to do a task at the studio, I'm expecting them to have integrity to when they do that task, accountability. But I'm also saying to myself, is this a task that actually needs to be done? What are the outcomes of this task that will benefit not just the staff, but also the clients too? So you develop your own decision making tree for the type of work that you're trying to do. And that might look slightly different for your personal life. But these are just, some of the frameworks that you can use when you're making decision making in the moment.
How do you make rational, good decisions without the fantasies coming in? And I don't know what your personal experience is like, but I often catch myself drifting away from the practicality of the decision, and you start getting caught up with this grandiose vision of how the business is going to play out, how things are going to develop. How do you actually stick present to a business system, a framework that's going to inevitably bring long-term success rather than get caught up in the emotion itself?
So, this is going to sound silly, but a good plan. So, you need to know where you are and where you want to be, but you need to create steps along the way that are engaging for you. Steps that you'll do and you'll take wins in every single time you do those steps. If you're not if you're not enjoying the process of it, then there's no point doing it, because the end goal will always just get pushed into something else. But enjoying the hard yards that go with it to get there, that's how you're going to be able to keep that fantasy at bay. The fantasy will be there, but it's not going to dominate your decision making, because you're focused on the steps in the moment to get you there.
How do you discern between necessary suffering for business growth versus misalignment, and this is the pursuit I'm undertaking is not a reflection of my values?
Sure. So I can give you some examples of that. So after we'd opened our first studio, it'd been open for maybe 3 years or so by this point, and we saw this need for our clients to give them a little bit more. We were having all these conversations in the studio, and we decided, you know what, let's learn about life coaching. So we both did our certification in life coaching, and we were both life coaching as well as running the studio. But there came a point where we were starting to find we weren't not that we weren't enjoying it, but there was something that was sticking for my wife and I that we couldn't quite figure out until we sat down and really talked about it. And we realized that it went all the way back to our original reason for opening the studio, which was to have freedom and time to choose our time the way that we wanted to spend it. And one aspect of the one-to-one coaching was that we were locked into working with clients, and some clients would reschedule. Then we would see them on the rescheduled appointment, but then we'd already put our energy into getting into the call, and we realized that, you know, time is actually more important than we realized our own time that is. And so in that moment, we realized that while we love coaching, we just had to do less of it that made up the whole sum of our day. Because for us personally, and we have a 2.5-year-old, we saw a future where we would need to pivot and do things that required our attention, and being locked in wasn't part of that.
I feel like at our core, everyone values that freedom, but through their own conditioning and experiences have been put into their amygdala in their survival state. How do you balance paying the bills, doing what's necessary to survive, but also becoming conscious of the greater picture and the finite nature of our existence to really cherish your time, prioritize it? Because it seems like there's this real push and pull between paying the bills, surviving, but also thinking about the things that are really important, like time and freedom. And
Yeah, these are the the core questions often that people come into coaching for. It's like, how do I balance making money with the time that I want to do the things that I want to do? And I think that's where often people are misaligned in terms of the work that they do from the work that they want to do. And, you know, working with FIFO workers and working as a FIFO worker myself and coaching FIFO workers, the thing that was apparent, and it was like they were giving up so much time of their own time doing things that they didn't really want to do, and then really getting lost when they wanted to change because they didn't want to give up the money. And so a lot of mindset work goes into reframing what they think about money and actually thinking about what they really need, and deciding whether going into a bit of a survival mode and really thinking of their finances, but in order to be happy, that's something that everyone has a personal journey that goes through that. And you get to a point where if you are sort of living by your values and the work is allowing you to live by your values, and you come home every night positive, energized, and ready to go the next day, what's that worth financially to you? I often say that, you know, you could go into work and you could work in a windowless room, fluorescent lights all day, but at 4 o'clock you're like a zombie. How much money would you take away from your salary in order to not feel that way? So this is a reframe that you can do and say, you know what? I need energy to do my hobbies at night, and this job is taking away from that. So perhaps I need to look for a less paying job, which will mean less wages, obviously, but it's going to give you the energy to actually live your life.
How do you know that something is aligned and authentic? Because a lot of the time I'll give you my perception of what I believe it is. I think we know when we're on our mission. This is what Mitchell Vickridge was educating me about last week, was we know we're doing something that is truly authentic and aligned to our core purpose when we are missing the ion. So he calls it mission. So if you break down the word mission, it means missing ion, miss ion. And the ion is the emotional charge in the fantasy or the nightmare. So if you ever notice when you're doing something that's truly meant for you, there seems to be more flow state attached to these experiences. You seem to be less in your head, more present, more engaged, because it's usually an extension of something that's really important to you. It's that balance of being challenging because you're curious and you're engaged, but also not too challenging because it's somewhat natural to you. So I feel like if you can reflect on experiences where you feel more present, more engaged, and you can lean in and reflect on those, I feel like you might be able to come to understand your mission in life, your personal mission, because it's not a fantasy where often I think the fantasy comes from fear, which is the fear of whatever experiences we've gone through, and we associate with the fantasy because part of us is dreading certain aspects of our current experiences. So let's just say, for example, we had a toxic relationship with money, through whether we were from our parents or we lost a lot of money, and suddenly we're fixating on money quite a lot. We start associating with this fantasy of having millions of dollars. So it ends up being this coping mechanism that takes us away from reality. And we might convince ourselves that that is an authentic, meaningful pursuit because it is something we can't stop thinking about, but there is such a strong emotional charge attached to it. So, but it's not missing the ion because there's a strong charge. Whereas if you're doing something that, I don't know, you're more neutral, but it's positive, but it's not a fantasy, or it's not also in the fear. It's a hard thing that I'm still trying to wrap my head around, but I feel like when you reflect on things that are more, when you're more in a flow state, they seem to be more aligned to your core values.
Yeah. I can give you like a really good day-to-day decision-making protocol that everybody can use. And this is going to hopefully answer some of your question. And it's going to help people to really see where they're at with their decision-making and see the impact that that decision might have. And it's essentially, I'll tell you the backstory for this, how I developed it. So my wife and daughter went back to Scotland a few years ago they went back for 6 weeks. Unfortunately, the studio wouldn't survive 6 weeks at that time without me, so I spent 3 weeks here. Then I went and joined them at home. But during that first 3 weeks, I was left to my own devices. So, because we've got a young kid, like, there was a heap of stuff that just didn't have time to do. And then all of a sudden, I've got all this time to do the things that I like to do. And, some of that was catching up on TV shows. Some of it was watching movies that I've always wanted to watch. And there was one night where I was watching this TV show. And then I was like, oh, I'll put another TV show on, and another one, and then another one. And I must have watched about 4 hours TV, and I was enjoying it. And then all of a sudden I went to go to bed, and I'm lying in my bed, and my thoughts just went super dark. And I was like, what's going on here? Like I'm doing all the things that like I love. Like I love watching these TV shows. Like, why am I feeling this way? Why am I having this this absolute crash? And my thoughts went really dark. And it wasn't until maybe like a month later, listening to an Andrew Huberman podcast about the double dip with dopamine, that I really understood that those low level dopamine hits that I received through that, instead of doing that, then watching another show to bring my dopamine back up, it actually double dipped downwards, and it became an even harder trough to get out of. And then I started to think about how my dopamine balance would be balanced through the day, and then started to think and develop a strategy around making better decisions. So I did what I normally do. I go in for a float tank and I dwell on that experience. And during the float, I developed this coaching framework, which, if you wanted to visualize it, imagine there's 4 doors, and in each door is a choice. So you have an activity that you have in mind, and you're deciding whether this is the best use of your time, or whether this decision gets you closer to the goal that you want to achieve. Door number 1 is in alignment. This is an activity that has low effort but high fulfillment. And what that means is that is something that ticks your values. So that might be spending time with family, friends, might be going for a walk with a friend along the coast, requires zero effort, but creates a long-lasting memory. So that's another thing that people should really think about as well, is thinking not just in terms of like you're in the flow, but in terms of, will this create a long-lasting memory that I can look back on positively? Because all these positive things that you keep in your subconscious, you can draw on them in the future when things do get dark. That is something that I've experienced for sure. So that's a super important door to go through. So if you go through that door, you're doing well. Second door is also a positive door. This is growth. This is doing the hard things that you don't want to do in order to meet the goal of the future.
Is this the high effort, high fulfillment?
Yeah, high effort, high fulfillment. So you would go through that door, things like the gym, things like learning a new skill, anything that requires physical or mental effort. So if the activity you have in mind is in that door, then that is also good. Third and fourth door are negative doors. The third door is short-term fulfillment, but low effort, and that can be things like
Alcohol, like
alcohol.
These are the cheap.
These are the
dopamine
cheap
fixes,
hits. Yeah. These are the ones that you watch a movie, 3 hours later you've forgotten the whole plot. They might be doom scrolling on your phone, just on Instagram, just no purpose, just you've got no idea what's coming up next, but you're just chasing the dopamine hit. And that's where I was. That was the door I went through, and I made the decision to watch all those movies back to back. They were not. They were allowing going into the double dip of the dopamine dip. So you want to try and avoid those. But I will say that there are obviously movies and TV shows that would fit number 1 or number 2. It might be a challenging documentary that you've been really wanting to watch, that you really focus on. For me, there was a movie that came out this year, and I've been waiting a year to see it. So that's a long-lasting memory for me. So when I went to see that movie beforehand, I decided that that was box number 1, not box number 3. Box number 4, door number 4 is low effort, high. It's a high effort and no fulfillment. Now, for a lot of people, that may be going to a job that they absolutely hate, that they get absolutely nothing from. It might be a toxic relationship. So I would urge people to start thinking of their life and seeing where particular things that they're currently doing fit into these 4 doors. And if you're finding that there's things in door number 3 and door number 4, either remove or lessen those activities and fill your day more with door number 1 or door number 2.
How would you advise people to balance things like watching movies, TV shows, quote unquote relaxing, versus like those cheap dopamine hits? Like, I think people really struggle to, if you're a type A person, you struggle to stop doing the work, stop engaging in these high effort, high leverage, high fulfilling tasks. How do you prioritize the little things, switch off your brain, but balance that with not doing it too much?
I would say, and I learned this the hard way since having our daughter and also having the studio. Before, when I was working FIFO, you would go hard all day. Like you'd be working super hard all day, but you knew when it got to 6 o'clock, you could afford not to really think about anything, to be honest, or physically not be expected to do any more work. So when you got up in the morning, you know, I just need enough energy to do what I need to do until 6 o'clock, and then I can recharge. And like most people are conditioned this way. They'll work during the day, they'll come home, they'll relax. They don't have to make many big decisions. You know, their their capacity to make decisions is diminished the longer the day goes on. Um, and so if you're going to make decisions, make them in the start of the big decisions, make them at the start of the day. And then once we opened the studio, I was wrestling with that that type of working, which was ingrained in me. And then I realized that like I I need to make big decisions at all points of the day. So if it's 8 p.m. and one piece of equipment breaks down, or there's a serious incident in the studio involving staff or a member of the public or anything, I need to have enough energy in the tank to be able to deal with that situation. Knowing that, it means that I need to adjust my activities through the day so that I have enough mental capacity to be essentially on call for those moments. Then when we had our daughter, when we, you know, she's in daycare a couple of days a week, the days that we pick her up from daycare, I can't go full tilt during the day, mentally, physically, because she requires a lot of energy from me to be present, to look after her, and to be able to react to the things that she wants us to do and what she needs. And so during the day, I have to put in the rest periods in order to have enough energy to react to those moments.
Mm. A thing I've been grappling with is taking action and not regretting taking action, but realizing we live in a world now where hard work doesn't guarantee success, in the sense that leveraging your action is more important, and being more intentional with your time and where you put your time is more important. So what frameworks do you have around taking action and realizing that being intentional and using high leverage systems are more important for success than simply gritting the teeth through mundane tasks that might not actually be moving the needle forward?
There's a couple of things you can do. I would say that a lot of people are on a day-to-day basis, they're not really in alignment with their intuition when things are going wrong. I think it's really important that people have a good balance physically and mentally in order to be primed to notice when things are not going wrong and to strip away the ego when things go wrong too, or not to grind when you know you're not on the right path.
Mm.
If you think you're on the right path and that is moving you towards your goal and you're doing it for all the reasons that you wanted to do it, then your only option then is to continue, fail, and reflect, and then move. So failure can come at any time, but the skill set it really is to improve your ability to take a big picture view of your current situation and then decide whether this is still worth your time or whether a pivot needs to be made. Oftentimes I feel like a lot of people these days will just abandon a project too early before really realizing its potential. And there's a lot to be said for tweaking 1%, 2% here, and seeking help and getting perspective. A lot of people get really insular with projects, you know, like people go to work and you ask them what they're working on, and like, don't talk to me, like I'm busy. They can't see where the flaws are because they're so focused on it. So having a support network of people that are able to spot the flaws is really important. We have a culture at Clearmind Studio where every single member of staff can pull me up on things that perhaps I'm doing wrong, or they can question every decision that we're making if they feel that there is a better path to take. So that's where it comes back to the accountability and responsibility that we instill on the team. Because obviously having a team of like 25 people who are on the ball is better than having 2 people who are focused on the dream and on the ball.
How do you balance outsourcing feedback from members of staff, but also realizing the importance of having a central hub to connect all the dots of the business? Have you heard of something called the founder effect?
I have done, yeah.
Yeah, if the founder starts delegating, I guess it doesn't have the business starts to lose its feel and the things that made it good, because there is no longer a central hub that connects all different aspects of the system of the business.
Yep.
So how do you conceptualize creating feedback, but also realizing that the synergy is often made through, I guess, the central hub yourself?
Most businesses fail because they haven't got the systems in place to support it as it grows. As a business grows, the systems have to grow with it or adapt. Everybody needs to know their roles and responsibilities. And so everybody needs to come into work knowing what's expected of them. And you need a space within the week where reflection can take place. And there's lots of opportunities for that. There's lots of opportunities to be 1% better every day. And we take pride on when we find a better cleaning product to clean a toilet. Like, it's like, oh my God, this product's so much better. And it's like the whole team celebrates. And that's the kind of culture that you want. And that's, like we alluded to earlier, that's where you need to enjoy the process to not be thinking too far ahead, and making sure that the team also has that shared vision too, but also that they trust you to get there as well. I think that's the main thing. It's developing trust within the team that they can speak up and be heard, and their voice matters, but also that they trust that the decisions that you make are the best ones for the company moving forward.
I think becoming conscious of small wins and celebrating small wins can actually be more important sometimes than the big ones, because the big ones are so obvious, whereas the small ones, if we don't become conscious of small wins and progress along the way, we can often pivot because we're not becoming aware of how much progress we're actually making. And the problem with, I guess, only looking at the big things and having these big North Stars, if we fixate too strongly on them and we don't become aware of the stepping stones, we can abandon projects too early, we can pivot. And often when we pivot, we get short-term success, right? Because the pain and the enduring and the suffering of not having the results, there's often the immediate short-term outcomes from starting something new. But then we start to learn this lesson that change equals better. And that might not be the right lesson to extract from this experience. And then suddenly when we encounter something difficult, instead of figuring out why it didn't work, what we can do better, how we can grow our skill set, why the business system can adapt, we just think, oh, let's change what we're doing. Let's change the product. Let's fire this person, instead of being able to have a more bird's eye view of this situation to extract the right lesson from the experience?
I think a lot of people get when it comes to their big goals, a lot of people focus on a a goal that includes a number. But the problem when you have like a number, so your goal is to reach 10,000 people, to have 10,000 followers or something like that. A number is not emotional. A person is emotional. So it's hard to attach a number as a success to an emotional being. And what I mean by that is, I'll give you an example. Um, we, my wife and I, we've never set a number as a goal for our studio. We've never said we need to, by the end of the year we need to make X amount. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that our goals need to be a feeling. They need to be a way of being, because that is when you truly get the result that's closest to your values or your alignment. So our business coach was like, "How are you guys tracking this year?" And we were like, "Oh my god, we've we've made this. I just ran the numbers. We just ran the numbers. We just hit this massive number this year for the studio." And she's like, "You should celebrate. It's a huge win. You know, you've reached this like 7-figure number and everything." And we're like, "But it feels hollow. It's not why we're doing it. It's a rule. It's like now that you've told me we've reached this number, my head is already thinking of 50% more." And I'm like, this is a game that you'll never win. You'll never be able to chase a number goal, because because as soon as you reach it, the next number will just pop up. But if your goal is as for us, it's aligned around our work-life balance and the type of life that we want to live, and the environment we want to be in, and the people we want to surround ourselves with, it's much easier to see when you've achieved that goal, and it feels long lasting and it feels better.
That's powerful.
Once you do that, the numbers will come, because you're living in alignment and you're focusing on that alignment more, that subconsciously I believe that you will make better decisions and you will do your best work when you do it that way.
I feel like Pete spoke to me a lot about this when he started shifting his mindset to serving other people, because that to him was a really important value of his. And like, where your attention goes, your energy flows, and you pivot from fear mindset, scarcity mindset, like how am I going to pay this thing, to how can I create something that is beneficial, valuable to my customers. How do you do that though practically when there is a lot on the line? How do you change your perception of what is happening to actually enjoy creating something that is serving other people without letting the intrusive nature of money and goal setting of money come into your brain?
What is a business without its customers? You know, if you're not serving your customers, the money will never come, because the product that you're giving them isn't something that they want. So that's why I would say that when you're of service, when you're doing things that are what your clients or customers are asking for, even if they're not verbally asking you for it, like there's lots of times where we'll go over and above for a client. I think our business, our core sort of strategy really is customer service is key at every aspect, from the whole way from the client journey. And that's all we focused on. We've just focused on creating a better excuse me creating a better experience for the clients. When you have a focus on serving your clients, the 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 numbers and how to get there, it comes naturally.
Yeah, yeah. What do you advise you know, people in their 20s is, I think we all want to have it figured out, right? How important is it to invest in experiences, grow our knowledge bank? The frame that I've heard before is 20s is for learning, 30s is for earning. How relatable is that, I guess, motto for entrepreneurship?
I think people need to reframe the way they think about that. I think what you've said is absolutely spot on. The 20s is a fantastic place to experiment and find what works for you. I often say to people that, you know, if you finish university and you're 22 years old or something, if you were to say to someone that you had 20 years experience, so people would call you an expert in that field. Um, if you did 20 years in something, you'd be 42 years old. At 42, you could effectively stop exactly what you're doing, do something completely new, and at 62, you'd have another 20 years experience, and people would say you're an expert. I think a lot of people get caught up in being an expert, and they keep thinking of a generational job that they're going to do. So life's a long way. You've got a long way to go, and you've got a lot of skills to develop too. And there's nothing to say that you can't stop when you're 35 and pivot. I mean, when we opened Clear Mind Studio, I was 32. It was in my early 30s, and my wife's 2 years older, 3 years older than me, so she was like maybe 34. You can pivot at any point and be a success. There's nothing that you haven't done before where the skill set isn't applicable in some way. What stops a lot of people is the fear, whether that's survival, monetary, basic survival things. Where am I going to live? How am I going to eat? How am I going to maintain a relationship or find a relationship if I change what I'm doing right now? And I think that's where everybody needs to do a lot of thinking about where they want to improve their life and what risks they're willing to take in order to get there. And for some people, that they might be in a situation where it's untenable, they have to change. But for the vast majority of the population, it's like, it would be nice to do this career, but if I stayed here, then there's other things in my life that are good enough to offset making any change.
I feel like at the start of entrepreneurship, you put in 10 units of input for 1 unit of output, and then slowly over time, 1 unit of input gets you 10 units of output.
Absolutely, I definitely agree with that. There's a lot of times where when we first opened the first Clear Mind Studio, where we were developing the systems and the processes in real time, and we had clients, that were coming in all day, and we're at the end of the day, we're like a list of like 5 to 10 things that we could do better tomorrow. And that is something that a young entrepreneur really needs to be focusing on. It's the lessons learned at the end of the day, so that the next day can be more productive. You can better serve your clients, and you can get closer to the goal that you want. When we opened the second Clear Mind Studio in Fremantle, we had the benefit of all the systems and the processes and the lessons learned from the previous 5 years. And so the challenge for us was whether we could make our own personal situation work with the two studios. And that's where a lot of the work we had to do personally was that. So a goal for us is we only work 3 days a week, and our daughter's in daycare 3 days a week, and that's the only days we work. If we open a second studio, we know we need to do the hard yards in the beginning, because that's what you got to do to get it open. But how quickly would it take us to get back to just working 3 days again? And that was the main decision maker for opening that studio, was how quickly can we get back to the life that we like to live? And if that price was too high, we wouldn't have done it. You would have, and it could have been like, you will make millions of dollars off the second studio, but if it required us to work 6 days a week, we would have said no. And so that's a lens that we've honed over the years to help make our decisions more purposeful for us personally. Now, other people might have made that decision in another framework, and that's what everyone has to really look at.
To wrap it up, any concluding thoughts? Summarize the conversation.
I would say that, you know, we've talked a lot about decision making, and we've talked a lot about, you know, how to find out how alignment you are where you're currently at. I would say that for your audience, you know, doing the inner work to reflect on where your values are now is probably the key thing to drive their decision making moving forward. No one wants to waste time in their life, but you have to go through the experiences and fail and take those failings and then use them to help propel yourself forward. And that can be in a relationship, in a business, with family. We all don't like feeling shitty, you know, but when we do, it's important to realize that in order to feel that way, in order to not feel that way again, things might have to change. And if it's something that's within your control, then you should do it.
There's definitely a compound interest of experiences. The earlier you invest into experiences and knowledge and quote unquote do inner work, and often it's the hard experiences that reveal things internally to be worked on. The earlier you can do that, the better decisions you can make, because now you have access to greater internal data, which enables you to, I don't know, have more confidence, know what your values are, and then the earlier you do that, the earlier you're able to build this, as Pete calls it, personal capital, but build your inner self to make better choices, and it starts stacking upon each other, which I think is why I'm always advocating for people to take action, prioritize action over the perfect action. I think most people sit on the sidelines. I do think there's a lot of power in, once you've proven to yourself that you can take action, work hard, to learn refinement, learn practical tools. But I think we're in a world where most people are just living in fear and too scared to even step out into the playing field. I think most people, for an analogy, like most of us are looking at what's the best shoes to wear, what are the best clothing to wear, but we're not even out into the playing field yet. We haven't even stepped out into the arena, and I think that is more important. I think those steps 1 to 5, I think most people step at stuck 1, which is starting. And then I think a lot of this conversation was important though, because I think it's important to, the more you can become aware and conscious of your emotions, alignment, values as you go along, the earlier you can become aware of that, the quicker you can learn, and the quicker you learn, I guess, the quicker to your goals and to a more fulfilling life you can have.
I would add to that by saying that in today's society, people often think that the people who get rewarded are the ones that take action all the time, the ones that put their foot forward, make things happen. But while I agree with that, there's a cohort of people, including myself, that when we respond to a situation, we make the best decisions for us. And I'll explain that further. So, when you look back on your life and you look at all the positive things that have happened to you, you can see at what point you took action, or whether an opportunity came to you, you realized it, and then you responded in a way that felt in alignment. And if you look back and you realize that every time I took the front foot on a situation and I made things happen for myself, if things happen positively for you, that's a strategy that you should employ going through the rest of your life. But for me, the best things that have ever happened to me are where I've just been going about keeping myself options open, not forcing an issue. That's a key thing for responders, is not to force an issue. So like not forcing my will upon another person. So when I've been open to responding, the situations have come and I've been ready to respond in the way that works. But responding is not the same as reacting, because reacting is an emotional response. So that's why for someone like myself, it's important to be in that balance. And the Fremantle studio is an example of that. We weren't looking for a second studio. A friend of mine said that the previous place was closing down. And because I was open to that and I explored that, then we took action. So for anybody that's listening at home who might be a bit of an introvert, or someone who isn't used to being, forward with what they want, reframe it for yourself and just be open, but be ready to respond when opportunities come your way. And in order to respond to those, make sure that you're mentally and physically ready to see them when they do.
I think we react because there's an emotional charge tied to it. So, like, pivoting back to the conversation we had earlier, it's about neutralizing that charge. And somewhere we can do that is definitely in a float tank. So tell us about your studios before we wrap up.
Yeah, so Claremind Studio. So we're based in Inglewood and based in Fremantle. And we do flotation therapy, which is the thing that got me into all of this, really, from working FIFO. And infrared saunas, ice bath, traditional saunas, massage, and a few other exciting things coming up as well. Yeah, love to see you down there.
Awesome. Craig, thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much.